Is Oversimplified one of your favorite creators, but you're a little frustrated at his lack of uploads or his not as frequent schedules? Now, I have got the perfect channel for you. It is called Things I Care About, which I gotta be honest doesn't roll off the tongue as well as Oversimplified, but nonetheless, look at this. Look at this, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, come on. This is a screenshot from an Oversimplified video, right? So this creator here, Things I Care About, just took the old school oversimplified format and just said, hey, I'm just going to do the same thing. And honestly, why not? Right? I mean, it's clear. I don't think he's trying to claim like, yeah, this is 100% my art style. I think this is great, though. And it's on a topic that I really wish was covered more, which is the German Revolution. I skipped forward a few frames here, but he says right in the beginning, I watched maybe about the first 30 seconds of this and thought, okay, I have to film a video to this, right? You know the French Revolution, you know the Russian Revolution. You probably don't know that much about the German Revolution. And I won't spend too much time on it because, hey, that's what this video is for. But I'm really excited for this one. I'm curious what sort of spins he's going to take. I've just seen the art style. Let's get into it. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let's go from here.
You've heard of the French Revolution. You've heard about the Russian Revolution. But have you heard about the German Revolution? Filled with intrigue, treachery, and coup after coup after coup, where dreams of a socialist utopia turned into a fascist dystopia. Welcome to the craziest revolution of them all.
Well, that's a bold claim. Okay, I don't know about that one, but all right, sure.
In 1914, a certain Austro-Hungarian Archduke wanted to see if it was possible for him to go for a drive around Sarajevo and not get assassinated. It was not, and the world was flung into World War I. In Germany, political parties overwhelmingly supported the war. Even the Socialist Party, who were supposed to be anti-war, supported it, because they viewed the Russian Empire as the biggest anti-socialist power in Europe. The war was supposed to be over by Christmas.
All right, let's take a few steps back here. All right, so this is one topic of the Socialist Party. So this is referring to the SPD, right? The Sozialdemokratie Partei Deutschland. I probably just screwed up the name. But anyways, the SPD. And it is a bit confusing, right? Why did the socialists end up voting to join the war? Well, you need to take a step back there. They didn't really vote to join the war, right? But rather, 3 days after the war was declared, they voted in favor of war credits, which, to simplify it, basically meant that the government itself would then push funds towards the military to fund the war. That's a grand oversimplification, right? The reason why they voted for it, though, was it was going with the times, right? The war was incredibly popular with the people, and though the working class were more against it, and they actually staged strikes in June and in July of 1914, although Germany would enter in August, the SPD was really, at the end of the day, they became parliamentarians. I believe there were 100 or so deputies that were in the parliament at this time in 1914, and only a few of them really opposed the war. I think one of them was called Liebknecht. And the fact that they voted for it, they had probably a feeling that they didn't want the party to be banned again, because the party, I think, had been banned twice already at this point, and they wanted to have legitimacy throughout the party, believing that the party, by participating in parliament, could really push the revolution forward, right? And it would be one of the paths for it. So it might be true in that case that they saw Russia as the greater evil for the working classes, and hey, maybe fair enough, but I think that that's also something important to point out as well, is that they didn't really vote to join the war, but rather these war credits, which were a massive shock too, might I add. I think when Lenin actually heard the news, when Lenin heard the news, he didn't believe it, right? And there's a great video on this series actually by, I can't even say it, it's literally called CUCK Philosophy. I didn't name the channel, but he's a fantastic channel. And I think he has a 3-part series on Germany, enter the German Revolution. I'd highly recommend to go check it out. It's like 3 hours long. I watched it all like literally a week ago. That's why I was looking for German Revolution videos. I wanted to react to those, but I mean, 3 hours, come on. So here's your answer.
But it dragged on, and by 1916 there was still no end in sight. In the front lines, hundreds of thousands of Germans had already fallen, while back home, the economy crumbled. There had been no preparation.
And that was a lot of it. I mean, off top of multiple factors, though, the naval blockade of Germany was incredibly successful by the British, though as you'll see in a moment here, they did defeat the Russians in the east, but the Western Front never quite made the gains that they'd wanted it to.
Done for a long-time war. Skilled workers and farmers had been sent to the front, and all matters, political, military and economic, fell upon the army generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, who were determined to achieve victory at any cost and subjugated civilian life to the needs of the war efforts. What this meant for workers was 12-hour workdays at minimal wages and insufficient food. It cannot be overstated how much of an impact the war had in the German population. Just in 1916, 250,000 Germans died due to starvation or disease related to lack of food. In these dire conditions, a group of socialists led by a woman called Rosa Luxemburg openly defied the continuation of the war and founded the Spartacus League. As the war continued, more and more people joined the Spartakists. Why should we support the war? It is clearly an imperialist war driven entirely by capitalist control of the world market for the political domination of huge territories and to give scope to industrial and banking capital. My brother in Christ, I just asked for the time. And to be fair, they were right about the economic interest that caused the war, and people across Germany were beginning to see it.
Yeah, and it's important to note too is that the SPD is actually going to split off, right? The USPD and the SPD, you have the Spartakists as well, so there was a lot of divisions that were being run here through the party, a lot of ideological differences, a lot of pragmatic differences. You had some that believed that participating in parliament in and of itself was a bourgeoisie idea and conflict that didn't really push the revolution forward. You'll also have the failed Spartacus uprising, which comes up, which really wasn't a blame with the Spartakists, but hey, we'll get there. We'll get there.
The movement continued to grow and spread across factories in Germany, with workers going on continuous strikes until in June 1916.
Yeah, and again, those workers, not every single one of these workers is a part of the Spartakists, right? But rather, it's just a part of, they're either SPDs, the ideological factions are quite large at this point.
The emperor had two of the most important anti-war socialist leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, sentenced to prison.
Yes.
However, it was too little, too late. Hungry, tired and angry workers were beginning to identify more and more with socialist ideals and started to demand change. The emperor tried to appease the population by promising democratic elections in Prussia after the war ended. The Socialist Party became divided. Some wanted to continue the war and find reforms afterwards through elections. Others wanted an immediate end to the war, to the monarchy, and even demanded the proclamation of a socialist republic. The SPD split. The first group turned into the majority SPD and the second to the independent SPD, who joined forces with the Spartakists. The war took a turn for the better on March 3, 1918, when Russia officially surrendered, and a wave of patriotism swept through Germany as the Supreme Command could now move part of the Eastern armies to the Western Front. Many Germans truly believed that victory in the West was now at hand. Here you must keep in mind that news were highly manipulated. Newspapers reported only of victories, and defeats, if reported at all, were
We are literally the best at war.
described as tactical maneuvers, so the average German had a distorted sense of the state of the war. But reality was catching up. In September, the Balkan Front collapsed, and the Kingdom of Bulgaria, ally of Germany, capitulated. Austria-Hungary collapsed a few days later. Germany too was on the brink of defeat. During the Allied 100-day offensive between August and November 1918, they suffered defeat after defeat after defeat.
Yeah. And it's important to know here too that even Ludendorff, German, they knew that the defeat was on the wall, right? But at this point, you had tens of thousands of Americans arriving every month, and even though, it's kind of often portrayed as, as soon as America joined, they won the war. Not really, right? But it was clear that by 1918, after the U.S. had started obviously mobilizing a lot more troops, that by 1919 or even 1920, there were going to be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans in Europe, and Germany just could not have survived, right? Hindenburg and Ludendorff, they knew this. They knew this war was untenable. And after the 100 Days Offensive, that was it. But they would go on to craft the stab in the back theory, which is, well, not them personally, but they would shift a lot of the blame onto the civilian administrators, which would go on to create the stab in the back myth.
Fearing the inevitable, Generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg sent a representative to negotiate an armistice. American President Woodrow Wilson demanded as a precondition for surrender negotiations the retreat of Germany from all occupied territories, the cessation of submarine activities, and implicitly the emperor's abdication. With this demand, he intended to render the process of democratization irreversible. On September 29th, the Supreme Army Command informed the Emperor Wilhelm II that the military situation was hopeless. Give it to me straight, Ludendorff. How bad is it? I'm not gonna lie, it is very, very bad. I don't think we can hold the front for another 24 hours. We should request an immediate ceasefire. No way! The American president said he would only grant one if I abdicate. And you should. What? Whose side are you on? Mein Kaiser. If you abdicate, we can blame the defeat on the socialists for protesting.
Oh,
then, once the armies are back in Germany, we will use them to retake power. This was the birth of the stab in the back legend. The false
Okay, I swear I have not seen this video before. I promise I have not seen this video before.
Belief that revolutionaries had undermined, sabotaged and attacked the undefeated German army from the rear, turning an almost certain victory into defeat.
Yes.
However, 8 out of the 10 socialist leaders just happened to be Jewish, and quickly the conspiracy theory went from targeting socialists to including Jews as responsible for the German defeat. With 2.7 million dead, there were few families untouched in Germany, and people were bitter. In October 1918, over 1 million workers striked throughout Germany. Tired of the old regime, they formed councils or Räte after the Russian Soviets, seeking to establish their own socialist republic. But the leader of the MSPD, Friedrich Ebert, looking to weaken the influence of the Soviets, negotiated an early termination of the strike. The emperor abdicated, and Ebert considered the continuation of the revolution to be unnecessary. On October 20...
Yeah, and Ebert... Ebert was he was clearly a socialist, right? So he was brought up through the party schools. I believe he was a teacher in the party schools. I think he taught Liebknecht, right? Or maybe it was the other way around, or he taught Luxembourg or something around this, but they had a personal relationship. And he is an very controversial figure even to this day. He basically goes and he crushes the revolution. He makes a deal with the devil with the right-wing revolution, with the right-wing reactionists, right, and especially the Freikorps, and would go and basically crush the revolution or any sort of ideas of proclaiming a socialist republic in Germany. Now, obviously, it's up for debate of what would have happened if a socialist republic was declared, but nonetheless, the tactics that Ebert would involve into crushing the revolution, right, into crushing these workers' councils, and basically reinstating what was formerly there in Germany. I believe it was his intent to have the Kaiser be in some sort of position, right, or to keep some sort of the old power structures there and not to declare a democratic republic. I'm sure we'll see later here about the actual proclamation of the Democratic Republic of Germany, the Weimar Republic, if you will. He's quite upset about that. Liebknecht would go and declare a socialist one, but he's not a figure that I'm particularly fond of, and I think it's up for debate, so I won't go too deep into it, but certainly controversial.
24th, General Ludendorff changed his mind and declared the conditions of the Allies to be unacceptable. He now demanded the resumption of the war that he had declared lost only 1 month earlier. However, he did not have the support he expected and fled to Sweden with false papers. But while most Germans prepared for peace, the Imperial Naval Command in Kiel planned to dispatch the Imperial fleet for a last battle against the Royal Navy. The British think we are about to surrender, so this is the perfect time to attack. Any questions? Did the High Command authorize the attack? Not quite, but Admiral, the new government is engaged in peace negotiations. Wouldn't an attack undermine them? Okay, no more questions, just raise the anchor, we're moving.
No. Nope. There you go.
Well, that's just rude. Sailors on board 3 ships refused to weigh anchors. Some committed outright mutiny and sabotage. They were arrested without resistance and imprisoned in Kiel. Still, they achieved their goal. The Naval Command had to drop its plans for a naval engagement. On November 1st, hundreds of sailors joined forces with the socialists to demand an immediate release of the prisoners. Raising slogans of peace and bread, they also demanded the end of the war and the improvement of food provisions.
Yeah.
More and more people joined the protesters as they moved toward the military prison. Sub-Lieutenant Steinhäuser ordered his patrol to fire warning shots and then to shoot directly into the demonstration. 7 people were killed and 29 severely injured.
And it's important to note here that this is the first time that blood has been spilled in the name of the revolution, right? This is the first time that the power structures that be at the time are being overthrown, or at least being challenged, right? Being attacked, because the war is clearly not going well for Germany. And blood has now been spilled in the name of the revolution. This is a very important point in the story of the German Revolution.
Some demonstrators returned fire, and the mass protest turned into a general revolt. The governor of the naval station was compelled to negotiate the release of the prisoners. By the evening of November 4th, Kiel was firmly in the rebels' hand. Delegations of sailors dispersed to all the major cities in Germany. By November 7th, the revolution had seized all large coastal cities, as well as Hanover, Brunswick, Frankfurt am Main, and Munich.
Yeah.
Workers and soldiers formed councils, and by the end of the month, all 22 German monarchs had been dethroned.
Yeah, and let's go to that map for a quick second. So the other thing that's important too is that the workers' councils look differently in different parts, right? Not all their aims were exactly the same. Example, in Hanover or in München, right? They had different ways of looking at it. There were different ways that people were elected. So it's kind of presenting this as saying the revolution, it was one thing, it was one organized entity. You have the government and then the anti-government, the revolution is a thing, and even I'm sort of using those terms too, but it's important to know that these are all separate cases, all with separate goals, different people, different organizations, different structures. And there was some confusion too. It was a confusion of, well, is it over? Have we won? Is this the new way of doing things? Are these the new governments that are in place? And it really wasn't quite clear, right? Until you get the eventual proclamation of the Democratic Republic.
Councils, and by the end of the month, all 22 German monarchs had been dethroned. But apart from the dynastic families, the councils deprived only the military command of their power and privilege. They did not interfere with the duties of police, municipal administrations, and courts. There were hardly any confiscation of property or occupation of factories, because such measures were expected from a new government.
That is super, super, super critical to understand too. And it's probably, depending on your opinion, maybe this was a good thing because of how everything, well, all right, I'm not going down that path of how everything turned out for Germany. But anyways, this was the most important thing. They did not destroy the power structures that were there, right? They did not kick out the capitalists. They didn't overthrow. They didn't, well, in some places in Germany, for example, in Bavaria, but generally, right, these were done through very peaceful means. It was to see that the government is going to come in and this is going to be ushered in an orderly manner. And the fact that the state apparatuses still existed and still had power, the revolution at this point is not expecting the counter-revolution, which is coming very, very quickly. And it seems as though they were almost blindsided by it. They hadn't even expected this counter-revolution, which at this point is already brewing. So the fact that, and by the way, I'm not advocating to say kill these people or anything, but the fact of the matter is that if you want to have this revolution, you need to completely abolish the power structures that are in place, right? And let me be very clear, I am not advocating here for killing people or anything, but the civilian administration, the people that own the large factories and everything like this, you need to bring in that new way of doing things, I suppose.
Hoping to gain over the middle-class parties and all the elites of the German Empire, and fearing a radicalization of the revolution that could lead to a civil war, Ebert, the leader of the majority Socialist Party, met with the leaders of the old regime. They reached an agreement, and Ebert was made chancellor. Karl Liebknecht, recently released from prison, returned to Berlin and planned to proclaim Germany a socialist republic. SPD Deputy Chairman Philipp Scheidemann heard about this and immediately stepped out a balcony of the Reichstag and proclaimed Germany a democratic republic in front of demonstrators. This upset Ebert, who wished to leave their choice of political system to a national assembly. Just hours later.
Right, and to be clear, the National Assembly would be more in the way that Germany was already looking at that point.
Later, Liebknecht proclaimed that Germany was now a socialist republic and called for election to form the Council of People's Deputies, who on November 11th signed the armistice that officially ended World War I.
Right, and so now you have two warring factions that have ideological differences that are not as extreme as, for example, the reactionaries on the right and those on the left. However, obviously those in the MSPD or the SPD, if you will, just use that term, and the USPD are obviously different, which have the Spartakists as well, right, who are a different organization than the USPD and much, much smaller. Very important to note that this was not, the Spartakists were not in the numbers of hundreds of thousands, right? But this is really one of those points where you have two republics that are claimed. Now, the Democratic Republic, just use that term for lack of a better one, actually has backing behind it. It has the large parties behind it. Even the right-wing parliamentarians, right, are changing their party structures and even their names, throwing Democratic into there to show how much they're for, I suppose, this new system of doing things. But then the Socialist Republic has no backing behind it. It just has this smaller break-off faction of the larger one.
The new government passed the 8-hour workday and severely strengthened worker unions. They expanded social insurance, unemployment benefits, and worker compensations, while working on a series of projects to improve health insurance and housing availability. In the meantime, the Supreme Command was raising its own paramilitary force, the Freikorps, paramilitary organizations that would operate inside Germany. Many of its members were former soldiers who struggled to readjust to civilian life. They were very nationalistic and ferociously anti-socialist.
Yep.
In December, all of Germany's councils were to meet in Berlin to vote on whether to make Germany a council or Soviet republic. Ebert and his government ordered the army to move into Berlin to prevent the convention. But while attempting to arrest the council leaders, the soldiers opened fire on unarmed demonstrators who were supporting the convention, killing 16 people. Despite the massacre, Ebert's plan to prevent the convention failed. But it was also unnecessary. The convention voted overwhelmingly against the creation of a council system and instead supported Ebert's call for elections to choose a constituent national assembly that would decide upon the state system.
Right, and it's important here, as I said before, the Spartakists do not have the same numbers in terms of the SPD. And the SPD at this point, the Spartakists and the USPD, right, the SPD at this point is really calling for unity. Picture yourself, right? You're just a normal, everyday middle class, working class, anything like this person that's seeing this absolute chaos unfold, right? You want to go back to that order. You want to go back to that unity. And that's really the message that the SPD is pushing here for people. And they actually go against the more radical option, right? The more ideological option, and vote against the Spartakists.
During the revolution, an elite regiment, the Revolutionary Guard, had been stationed in Berlin to protect the government. But Ebert now feared that they were getting too friendly with the Spartakists. So on December 23rd, he dismissed them from Berlin and ordered to reduce their members. To force them to comply, the city commander Otto Wels held their pay. The Revolutionary Army seized the Reichschancellery and arrested several members of the government until their salaries were paid. Chancellor Ebert called upon the army to force them out, attacking them in the skirmish of the Berlin Schloss.
Yep.
However, many of Ebert's soldiers defected, and the Berlin police, led by Emil Eichhorn, refused to act against the revolutionaries.
Which, by the way, if I remember correctly, Eichhorn is actually a socialist, right? Eichhorn was brought up in the SPD, party structure as well, if I remember that correctly. That's why he didn't launch his police force against the revolutionaries here.
With over 30 dead and 50 wounded, the battle was a clear defeat for Ebert's government, who was forced to pay the sailors and postpone their size reduction. However, the confrontation was a turning point for the Spartakists. Tired of the SPD, they left the party and formed the German Communist Party, KPD. On January 4th, 1919, Ebert dismissed police chief.
All right, and even the Communist Party, I won't get into it because this is getting long enough, but or at least this will be long enough. But even the KPD, the naming of this, right, was a whole, what would you say, ideological divide process in and of itself of whether to go with the Communist Party of Germany or to continue the terms of socialism, right?
Eichhorn for failing to act against the revolutionaries and demonstrating workers. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets the very next day, many of them armed. The demonstrators occupied train stations and several newspapers that the previous day had called not only for the raising of more Freikorps, but for the murder of the Spartakists.
Yeah.
On January 8th, Ebert decided to use troops stationed in Berlin against the occupiers. They violently quelled an improvised revolt on January 9th, and just a few days later, the Freikorps moved into Berlin. They brutally cleared several buildings and executed the occupiers on the spot.
Yep. And that's the thing, there was no... Really, it was a take no prisoners type thing, right? And yeah, they massacred their own people, really.
Freikorps murdered at least 100 workers, even those who surrendered.
Yep.
Just a few days later, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were arrested and delivered to a Freikorps division that beat them up and executed them.
Yep.
The perpetrators of the murders went mostly unpunished.
And what's interesting to note too is that Rosa Luxemburg, when she was caught, she brought books with her, right? She packed books with her because she believed that she was just going to go back to prison, which at this point she had already been to, I believe, twice, right? If memory serves. And so, right, she was put in the back of a car. The car was driven out, and then I believe she was shot in that car and then just thrown into one of the rivers in Berlin. And really quite savage to shoot an unarmed woman in cold blood, and Karl Liebknecht in the same way, right?
After coming to power, the SPD...
And for all this to be under, what would you say, the blank check of barbarianism that Ebert really sort of passed.
The government had not wiped out the Army Supreme Command or the judiciary. And now, the judges, many longing for a return to the old order, gave right-wing criminals, assassins and terrorists a slap on the wrist for their crimes as long as the victims were either revolutionaries or associated with the new democratic German state.
Exactly, and that was the point that I was trying to make, is that all these structures of power were left in place. Not the wise idea.
The few people that went to prison for the murder of the Spartacus leaders were later compensated by the Nazi government, and later investigations showed that the murders of Karl and Rosa had been approved by Ebert himself. From this point on,
Allegedly.
The political differences between the SPD and the KPD became insurmountable, and in following years they would be unable to work together to stop the rising threat from the Nazi Party. The first elections came shortly after. The SPD...
Yeah, and it's important to note that too, that the ideological differences were just... The left basically ate itself apart, right, during this time in Germany. And although the SPD, and again, the KPD at this point is incredibly tiny, right? Incredibly tiny, almost insignificant to pose any threat to the SPD. So it wasn't that as soon as the KPD formed, they had 400,000 members or something ridiculous like this. It was very, very, very tiny, right? However, it was an ideological force that would only grow over time, especially into the 20s and particularly into the early 30s when the rise of the Nazi Party would occur.
He became the strongest party and joined with other center parties to form the Weimar Coalition. Ebert was elected president. The new Weimar Constitution offered more possibilities for a direct democracy by setting up a mechanism for referendums. It also had a simple rule. You gain 60,000 votes, you gain 1 seat in parliament. While this allowed for more representation, it also made it very difficult to build coalitions. In fact, no parties achieved a majority during the 1920s. There was another massive problem. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution...
Wait, can you say that one more time?
Very difficult to build coalitions. In fact, no parties achieved a majority during the 1920s. There was another massive...
You say no parties or no party? Anyways, the point is that, yeah, obviously the point is to build a coalition here. Okay, I might not have understood correctly there.
Problem. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution granted the president the authority to rule against the majority in the Reichstag with the help of the army, if need be. Article 48 would become instrumental in destroying German democracy. In Bavaria, the USPD, who had political control over the state after the Bavarian king's resignation, suffered a crushing defeat in the elections. Eisner, the Bavarian USPD leader, was assassinated by a right-wing terrorist just days later.
Yeah, and it's important to note that the Bavarian Soviet Republic was actually declared under Kurt Eisner, which was not very long-lasting, was marred by complete chaos, and there wasn't any sort of progress that was able to be made.
Listen, I know this looks bad, but I swear it was him. Rumors blamed another socialist leader who was then shot twice by one of Eisner's supporters while inside the parliament. Fighting broke out, killing 2 other members. Because of the chaos, Bavaria no longer had an effective government. The new socialist leader, Johannes Hoffmann, organized a new coalition government, but was overthrown by a group of communists who proclaimed Bavaria to be a Soviet republic. But this government was then overthrown by another communist group, who were then overthrown by the return of Hoffmann and several thousand soldiers and Freikorps, who brutally ended the Soviet republic. 600 people were killed during the fighting, 300 of them civilians. After their victory, Freikorps executed at least 1,000 people suspect of being communist. Bavaria officially joined the Weimar Republic. The left was divided once more, and the chaos of the period made the state shift significantly to the right.
I don't know if I quite agree with that term. It was really more against revolutionary versus reactionary. I don't think it was particularly that it went to the right, but rather that due to the divide on the left, the reactionary forces won in this case.
In June 1919, the government signed the Treaty of Versailles, officially ending World War I. The treaty made Germany renounce sovereignty over its colonies and lose a large portion of territory. A part of Germany would be occupied for 15 years by the Allies, and they were forced to pay massive reparations, the amount of which no one even knew how to estimate. They also had to accept all guilt for the war and its consequences.
And funnily enough, out of all of this, this was the one that really irked people the most, I suppose, or would be the most powerful propaganda point. And I've talked about this before, but the Treaty of Versailles was by far not the worst one. What was inflicted on Austria-Hungary was, I mean, it carved up all the nations of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and made Austria into almost the modern borders that it has today, really. But anyways, that's a different topic for a different time.
All of this was incredibly upsetting for Germans, who despised the treaty, and those who signed it. But there was another demand. The treaty required Germany to demilitarize significantly, and that meant that the Freikorps had to be disbanded. In February 1920,
This will have no repercussions whatsoever on the immediate future.
Defense Minister Noske ordered the disbandment of two of the most powerful Freikorps divisions that were stationed near Berlin. These Freikorps were extremely opposed to Eber's democratic government, and their commander Erhard refused the dissolution. He reached out to his allies Wolfgang Kapp, Generals Walter Lüttwitz, Erich Ludendorff, and even Waldemar Pabst, the man responsible for the murders of Liebknecht and Luxemburg. Erhard ordered his brigade to march into Berlin and ruthlessly break any resistance. They carried swastikas on their helmets and vehicles, and it was here that it would become a symbol for anti-government and anti-Jewish sentiment.
Really?
The city's defenders refused to fire on the soldiers, claiming that Reichswehr doesn't fire on Reichswehr. The government fled the city. With support from the troops and higher echelons of society, Kapp declared himself Chancellor.
It's a good way to end it on, actually, but would not exactly work. The Kapp Putsch was ultimately ended in a failure, but if you want to know why it ended in a failure, check out the next one. I'll also do a reaction to part 2, but hey, what did you think, right? That is the oversimplified style. I thought that was an excellent video. I really, really like that. And this is a topic that doesn't get talked enough about, and I hope you learned something. I did while watching this, and yeah, let me know what you think and what you thought in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching and for all your support. I will see you again soon.